The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as the night shift began at Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver. Megan O'Brien pushed through the ER entrance at 11:13 p.m., her badge clipped to navy scrubs, her dark hair pulled back so tight it erased her features. She had been at Sacred Heart for exactly 2 weeks. Nobody knew her name. The way she preferred it. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the corridor like a permanent resident. She moved past the day shift nurses trading complaints about staffing and insurance denials. None of them looked at her. Megan clocked in, checked the assignment board, and found her station, night shift, med-surg floor, 8 patients, and one name that made her pause. Room 314. John Doe. VA transfer. Notes: unresponsive, non-verbal, admitted 6 days prior. She tucked a faded unit patch deeper into her jacket lining, a gesture so automatic her hands moved without permission. The patch was all she had left from another life. 20 years pressed into fabric and thread. She checked her watch at 11:51 p.m. The night floor was already quiet, the daytime machine silenced, the hallway reduced to the periodic beep of monitors and the whisper of the fax system pushing cool air through the ducts. Room 314 was at the far end of the corridor. Megan didn't rush. Rushing drew attention. She moved with the kind of efficient calm that came from having done harder things in darker places. Her hands were steady. Her breathing even. Just another nurse starting another shift in a city where nobody asked questions about the quiet ones who worked alone in the dark. The patient was exactly as the chart described. John Doe. Male, approximately 60 years old, lean and scarred in ways that suggested decades of living hard. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at a ceiling he wasn't seeing. The ventilator beside his bed wheezed its mechanical rhythm, in, out, a sound that filled the room with the kind of presence that heavy equipment always carries. Megan approached the bed slowly. She didn't speak. She never did with unresponsive patients. Instead, she checked the 4 line at his wrist, her fingers brushing cold skin. She noted the temperature. She noted the pallor. She noted the way his chest rose and fell with mechanical precision. His chart said he'd arrived from the VA with no family listed, no emergency contact, no identification beyond a name that might not have been his at all. What the chart didn't say was that his hands bore the distinctive calluses of a man who had carried a rifle for 30 years. Or that his right shoulder bore the scar signature of a rotator cuff repair, military surgical pattern, not civilian. Or that his forearm bore marks consistent with trauma shears cuts from medical field dressing. Megan saw these things because she had been trained to see what others missed. She completed her assessment in under 7 minutes. Baseline vitals documented. Medication schedule confirmed. The foresight inspected and found adequate. The patient's mouth held the tension of someone who had learned, long ago, that silence kept you alive. Megan understood that language. She had spoken it fluently in places people didn't talk about. She left room 314 at 12:06 a.m. and returned to the nurse's station to complete her documentation. The fluorescent light above her workstation flickered, an intermittent strobe that had been annoying the day shift for 3 weeks. The hospital had filed a work order. Nothing had been fixed. Megan barely noticed it anymore. She had worked under worse light in places where dark was the default state. The night shift at Sacred Heart moved like a skeleton crew. 2 nurses for the entire surgical ward. 1 resident on call for emergencies. 1 attending physician supposed to be supervising but rarely appeared unless something went catastrophically wrong. The administration had done the math years ago, night shift was cheaper. 3 staff members instead of 8. 1 coffee maker instead of 2. Profit margins improved with every empty chair. Megan worked alone by design. She requested nights. She requested the most difficult patients. She requested 12-hour stretches when she could disappear into work and lose herself in the simple mathematics of medicine, respiration, pulse, oxygen saturation, urine output. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't ask questions. Numbers didn't care who you were before you put on a uniform with someone else's name tag. She was documenting the John Doe's baseline neurological status when Dr. Michael Hargrove appeared in the hallway at 12:19 a.m., still in his street clothes despite the hour. He was a day shift attending, had no reason to be here at midnight. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from a long family history and a medical degree from a prestigious institution. His shoes cost more than Megan's monthly car payment. His watch was the kind that required a 2-year waiting list. Hargrove glanced at Megan but didn't register her. She was invisible. Just the night nurse. Background noise. The kind of staff that made the hospital run but wasn't part of the actual system. He made his rounds in the daylight with the senior residents following behind him like students trailing a celebrity. He consulted on the interesting cases and referred the rest to people like Megan. He approached room 314 and pushed the door open without knocking. Megan watched from the nurse's station as he entered the darkened room and stood at the bedside for exactly 93 seconds. She had been counting. He didn't touch the patient. He didn't check the chart. He simply stood there, and his expression shifted into something that looked like calculation. When Hargrove left room 314, he didn't acknowledge Megan as he passed the nurse's station. He walked to the elevator, stepped inside, and disappeared. Megan returned to her documentation. She had one more patient to assess before 1 a.m. rounds. She had charting that would take another hour. She had medications to verify and falls to check and vitals to record. She had a job to do. That was all anyone needed to know. The night deepened around Sacred Heart. The city outside the windows had gone quiet. The rain that had started in the evening had stopped, leaving the parking lot slick and reflecting the sodium lights in abstract patterns. Megan moved through her rounds with the kind of systematic care that takes a long time and looks like meditation. She counted respirations. She checked pupils. She verified medication names against the chart 3 times before administration. By 2 a.m., all her patients were stable. The ventilator in room 314 continued its mechanical rhythm. The John Doe's eyes remained unfocused on the ceiling. Megan sat at the nurse's station and finished her documentation. She noted the patient's stability. She recorded the time, 2:38 a.m. She signed her name in the digital system, and the screen accepted her entry. The chart closed. She was permitted to exist here. For now. In the dark. In the quiet. Before anyone with real authority arrived and the daytime hierarchy reasserted itself. By the time Megan's shift ended at 7 a.m., Sacred Heart had transformed. The day staff arrived in layers. The attending physicians returned. The administration staff filtered through the corridors making decisions about other people's work. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with renewed intensity. The smell of antiseptic was stronger somehow, as if the building itself performed an identity shift when the daylight arrived. Megan clocked out and walked to her car. The early morning was cool. The parking lot was filling with day shift vehicles. Nobody greeted her. Nobody waved. She was already becoming a memory of the night. By 7:15 a.m., she was invisible again. And that was when the real game began. The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's cafeteria cast everything in that sickly institutional white as Megan carried her tray toward a corner table at 6:16 a.m. Turkey sandwich. Black coffee. A container of applesauce she wouldn't eat. She'd worked nights for 14 years. Breakfast at the end of a shift had become ritual, not appetite. The cafeteria was half full. Day shift nurses clustered in their usual spots, checking phones, comparing notes on admissions. She kept her head down. Invisible was safer. Dr. Hargrove was waiting. He materialized beside her with 2 residents trailing like remoras behind a shark, his white coat pristine, his watch catching light, something expensive, something that announced he wasn't like everyone else here. He smiled. The smile was the warning she missed, because she was already moving past his shoulder toward the empty table. His elbow caught her tray. Not hard. Not obviously. Just enough. The tray tilted. Turkey sandwich skidded across the cafeteria tile like it had been shot from a cannon. The applesauce container burst open against the floor with a wet slap. Coffee exploded in a brown spray across her scrubs. For 3 full seconds, the cafeteria went absolutely silent. Then Hargrove laughed. The 2 residents joined him instantly, that nervous, obedient laughter of people who'd learned that laughing with the surgeon kept you in his good graces. 2 day shift nurses at a nearby table exchanged glances but said nothing. A nursing assistant started to stand, then sat back down, reading the room correctly. Nobody moved to help. Nobody moved at all. Megan stood motionless, applesauce dripping from her sleeve, the smell of spilled coffee rising like steam. Her hands were relaxed at her sides. Her breathing even. She didn't look at Hargrove. She looked at the mess on the floor, and when she finally moved, she walked to the supply closet without a word, retrieved a mop and bucket, and began cleaning while Hargrove and his resident sat down 6 tables away. She heard him say something about the new night shift and heard them laugh again. She mopped. That was all. 20 minutes later, at the nurse's station on the 3rd floor, she was documenting the end of her shift, vitals from room 314, medication administration records, notes on the mute veteran's respiratory status. Her scrubs were still damp. She'd changed them in the locker room and thrown the soiled ones directly into the trash. The shift supervisor, Patricia, a woman with 30 years at Sacred Heart and no patience for political games, had brought her fresh scrubs without commenting on the obvious stain. Hargrove arrived at the station like a storm front. He walked directly to where Megan stood, reached past her shoulder, and grabbed the stack of patient charts she'd just organized. 7 charts. Maybe 8. He held them over the counter between them, made eye contact with everyone on the day's shift, the nurses gathering for report, the residents preparing for rounds, and released them. The charts scattered across the tile floor like playing cards. Some slid under the medication dispensary. One hit a resident's shoe. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice was conversational. Almost kind. The kind of voice a man uses when he knows he has power and wants you to remember it. One of the day shift nurses, a newer RN named Cisco, bent down to help. Hargrove stepped on one of the charts, pinning it to the floor, and said, "I meant the night nurse." He was smiling. "I'm sure you can handle it alone." The room had contracted around Megan. Every eye was watching now. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. This was institutional violence dressed up as a joke, and everyone knew it. Megan took one measured breath. She knelt down and began gathering the charts. Her movements were controlled, precise. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble. She collected every single one, from under the counter, from beside Hargrove's pristine shoe, from where they'd scattered across the tile. She stood, holding the reorganized stack against her chest, and looked directly at Hargrove for the first time. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that people leaned forward to hear it. "I've picked up bodies in places you couldn't pronounce. Your paperwork doesn't scare me." Then she turned and walked to her locker. The silence lasted exactly 6 seconds. She could feel it, heavy as a physical thing, pressing down on the nurse's station. Then Hargrove's laugh, artificial, jagged, and Cisco muttering something about getting coffee. Someone's pager went off. The moment broke apart like thin ice. But something had shifted. The night shift nurse with the bruised hands and the too good reflexes had just said something that didn't fit. Cisco had noticed. He was staring at her locker door like he was trying to solve an equation written in cursive. One of the residents, a girl named Martinez, barely 28, sharp enough to notice everything, had her head tilted at an angle that meant her brain was working backwards through Megan's sentence, trying to figure out what kind of night shift nurse picked up bodies in unpronounceable places. Megan pulled on her jacket. The faded unit patch was sewn inside the lining where nobody could see it, a reminder, insurance policy, last resort. She'd been wearing it for 14 years without incident. She'd been invisible for 14 years without incident. And now, standing in the fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's 3rd floor, she understood that invisibility had an expiration date. Hargrove was talking to two administrators in his office by 8:13 a.m. She knew because she'd passed the open door on her way to sign out of the system. She didn't look inside. She didn't need to. She could feel the machinery beginning to turn. She'd seen it before in different contexts, the way powerful men activate their networks when someone has refused to break. The phone calls. The favors. The external leverage. By 8:51 a.m., Hargrove had already contacted the hospital's credentialing board. By 9:22 a.m., an outside investigator named Gerald Whitmore, the kind of man who charged $400 per hour and came with a briefcase full of pre-written accusations, had been added to the payroll. By 10:06 a.m., Hargrove had begun fabricating documentation of alleged scope violations. Megan had supposedly administered medications without proper supervision. She had supposedly given orders to nursing assistants. She had supposedly taken a telephone call while standing at a medication cart. None of it had happened. All of it was in writing. Hargrove was competent. That was the thing people didn't understand about men like him. He didn't rage. He didn't throw tantrums. He activated his network. He understood institutional power the way a musician understands an instrument, and he was playing Megan out of Sacred Heart with careful, methodical precision. At 2:38 p.m., Megan pulled into the driveway of the small house she'd rented for the past 8 years. A place where nothing marked her as unusual. A place where she was just another nurse, just another single mother working nights to raise a teenager who had no idea what his mother actually was. She sat in the car for 3 full minutes with the engine off, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her breathing controlled. She'd survived worse. Sangin Valley had taught her how to survive much worse. A classified extraction where 3 officials had sworn under oath that the mission never happened. A 6-year-old boy bleeding out in her arms, his mother dead beside him, the Taliban closing in. She had survived impossible mathematics, 7 SEALs, 47 insurgents, 1 village where everyone was a combatant. She had survived by being quiet, being useful, being invisible. She had survived by making peace with the fact that no one would ever know. The front door opened and her son, Marcus, looked out at her from the living room. 14 years old. Tall enough to look her in the eye now. Wearing a hoodie with a gaming logo on the chest. He was supposed to be at school for another hour. He looked confused when he saw her car. She got out slowly. Every movement ordinary. Every breath controlled. "Mom? Why are you home?" "It's only," he checked his phone. "It's not even 3. She walked past him into the kitchen. The sunlight was coming through the window at that specific afternoon angle that made everything look permanent and real and normal. She sat down at the kitchen table without answering. Marcus followed her, hovering in the doorway like he was trying to read a language he didn't understand. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't explain the cafeteria or the charts or Hargrove's voice saying "sweetheart" like it was the name of something disposable. She couldn't explain that she was home early because a man in an expensive watch had decided she needed to disappear. She couldn't explain that she'd spent 20 years being erased, and that erasure had just begun again, and that this time it might stick. Marcus sat down across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She could see him trying to solve this problem the way he solved everything, by looking at the data and making logical deductions. But there was no data he could access. There was only his mother in yesterday's scrubs, sitting at the kitchen table, and the first hair in 14 years sliding down her face without permission. "Mom." His voice had shifted. The teenage irritation had vanished, replaced by something else. Something that remembered, somehow, that his mother was not like other mothers. That she could move through a room like she was made of purpose. That her hands were scarred in ways she'd never explained. "Mom, what happened?" The monitors began screaming at 2:06 a.m. Megan was charting vitals in room 314 when the veteran's body went rigid. His back arched off the mattress. The seizure started in his shoulders and radiated outward like electricity finding ground. his limbs jerking in that specific violence that meant brain injury, meant trauma, meant the body betraying itself in ways only combat survivors understood. She knew this rhythm. She'd seen it in field hospitals in Helmand province when the dust settled and the shaking started. His lips turned blue. She moved before thinking. Muscle memory didn't wait for permission. The overnight resident, Dr. Paulson, fresh out of his second year, still had that look in his eyes that meant he'd never seen a real code. He froze at the door. Megan's hands were already pulling the pulse oximeter from the monitor. 92. 88. Dropping fast. Crash cart, she said. Not a request. A command. Paulson's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Now. The resident moved. His hands shook as he grabbed the intercom. Megan was already assessing. The veteran's chest wasn't moving. No rise. No fall. The ventilator was cycling air, but something was wrong with the delivery. His ribs weren't expanding. His oxygen saturation fell through the numbers like a stone through dark water. 75. 70. His face darkened from blue toward a color that had no name. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung. The kind of injury that kills in minutes if you don't decompress the thoracic cavity. The kind that required knowing exactly where to put a needle, how deep, what angle. The kind that separated trauma surgeons from civilians pretending they understood medicine. Megan's hands moved on their own. 14-gauge angiocath needle, she called out. The code cart crashed through the door. Two night nurses, Williams and Chen, skidded to a stop, reading the scene with the speed of veterans who'd worked ER long enough to know what chaos looked like. The needle was in her hand before she had to ask twice. She positioned herself at the patient's ribcage. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks lived in her hands the way other people carried phone numbers. She didn't think. Thinking slowed you down. Thinking got people killed. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. That sound, urgent, escaping, the small release valve that meant lungs could breathe again. The monitor beeped. Numbers climbing. 72. 78. The color began returning to his face like someone was slowly adjusting a valve on his humanity. 85. 90. The seizure stopped. 92. Stable. His eyes opened. Not slowly. Not gradually coming to consciousness the way patients normally surfaced from sedation. His eyes flew open like a man drowning suddenly finding air. They locked directly onto hers. Not confused. Not searching. Recognition. The kind of bone-deep recognition that happens between people who survived something together that nobody else would ever understand. His mouth moved. "Chief," he whispered. His voice was gravel over rust, a voice that hadn't been used in weeks. "Sangin. You saved me." The room stopped. Megan felt the moment stretch like taffy. Williams and Chen exchanged a glance. Paulson's face had gone pale in that way that meant he'd just realized he'd watched something he didn't have the framework to comprehend. The monitors kept their rhythm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular hum of artificial life, but everything else went perfectly, devastatingly silent. She didn't break eye contact. She couldn't. Because this man, this broken, mute veteran who'd been staring at nothing for 37 days, was Marcus Wade. Lance Corporal Marcus Wade, 6 years old, bleeding from a shard of concrete through his leg in a collapsed compound. The boy she'd pulled from under rubble while rounds snapped overhead. The boy whose mother had been dust and whose father was already gone. The boy she'd packed into a field dressing and carried back to the Chinook while the rotor wash tried to throw her sideways. The boy whose entire family had been listed as buried in a classified extraction that officially never happened. Her hand was still on the catheter. Her other hand found his shoulder and squeezed once. 2 beats. Then she turned to the monitors and began the systematic work of keeping him alive, because that was the only thing she could do without breaking the order that had kept them both hidden for 2 decades. Saturation holding at 93, she said, her voice level as glass. Get an X-ray. Portable unit, don't move him. I need continuous monitoring and a thoracic surgeon on standby in case we need a chest tube instead of needle decompression. Williams moved. Chen moved. Even Paulson moved, though his movements had that quality of someone operating on muscle memory while his mind was somewhere else entirely. Megan stayed beside the bed. She checked the line. She documented the procedure with her hand steady, her breathing even, her entire body operating with the precision that had kept her alive in Sangin and would keep her alive here. The veteran's eyes had closed again, but his hand had found hers. His grip was weak but present. 3 hours later, the X-ray confirmed what her hands already knew. The pneumothorax had resolved. The lung was re-expanding. The needle decompression had bought him exactly the time he needed to get to a place where people with surgical credentials could handle the rest. She was still in room 314, still documenting, when Dr. Hargrove walked in with 2 board members and an investigator she'd never seen before. The investigator was holding a folder. Hargrove's face had that expression, cold satisfaction, the look of a man who'd set a trap and watched something step directly into it. Ms. O'Brien, Hargrove said, we need to talk about your scope of practice. You performed a procedure tonight that requires physician oversight. You've been practicing medicine without a license. Megan set down her pen. She turned to face him. Her voice, when she spoke, had dropped an octave. Had changed in some fundamental way that made the board members take a small step backward. The patient was in cardiac arrest, she said quietly. Tension pneumothorax. 7 minutes before decompression and he would have been dead. Dr. Paulson was frozen. No one was moving. That's not practicing medicine. That's keeping someone alive. You don't have the authority to make that call, Hargrove said. I do, she said. I have more authority than you could fit in that entire building. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain beginning outside. Hargrove smiled. He shouldn't have. You're fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. 2 hours after that, Megan was in her car watching the hospital lights fade in her rear mirror. The rain hammered the windshield like applause for something she'd never wanted to win. Her hands were still steady but her vision had blurred. Not from tears. From the specific exhaustion that came when you saved a life and lost your career in the same 3-hour window. She didn't know that the veteran had whispered her rank to every nurse who entered his room after she left. She didn't know that Williams was comparing notes with the other staff, that Chen was pulling the medical dictionary offline to understand the procedure she'd just watched someone execute with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't know that somewhere in the Pentagon, at 5:22 a.m., a classified database had just registered a significant alert, a sealed name, a hidden identity, had surfaced on a hospital record. She didn't know that the phone call was already being placed. The monitor climbed. 75. 82. 90. Sinus rhythm. Megan's hands moved through the documentation with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before, not in hospitals, but in places where mistakes meant body bags. She recorded the needle decompression at 02 for 7 hours, the exact location of insertion between the second and third ribs, the immediate hiss of air escaping the pleural space, the patient's oxygen saturation recovery from 68 to 92 in 4 minutes. Each detail went into the chart with clinical exactness because exactness was survival. She didn't document that the patient's eyes had opened. She didn't document that he'd whispered Chief Sangin. She didn't document that somewhere in those 5 seconds of consciousness, 20 years had collapsed into nothing. The room had gone quiet after that. The resident still trembling beside her. The ventilator cycling in its mechanical rhythm. Megan had simply pulled the 14-gauge catheter back into her pocket, the one that wasn't supposed to exist in a nurse's hands, and finished her notes as if she'd just hung an 4-drip instead of decompressing a tension pneumothorax with the practiced calm of someone who'd learned the technique not in a classroom but at 0300 hours in a compound that no longer appeared on any map. By 0651 hours, as the sky turned that particular shade of grey that comes just before Denver sunlight, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Not the soft rubber soles of night shift. Not the quick staccato of day nurses arriving early. The heavy, deliberate stride of authority. Megan didn't look up from the monitor she was checking. She already knew. Somewhere in those 3 hours between the save and now, something had moved. Something had shifted. The Pentagon didn't just get quiet about things that happened at 0247 in room 314. Hargrove entered with the 2 board members flanking him like acolytes, Dr. Patricia Chen from Credentials, and Michael Sterling, the hospital administrator whose $3.2 million colonial in Cherry Creek had somehow been purchased on a 6-figure salary. Behind them came the outside investigator, a lean man with the bearing of someone who'd been hired to find exactly what Hargrove wanted him to find. All of them carried folders. All of them had already decided. Ms. O'Brien. Hargrove's voice was different now. Not contemptuous. Surgical. We need to discuss your actions during the emergency at 0247 this morning. Megan turned slowly, her badge still clipped to her scrubs where it had been 20 minutes ago. Her uniform was different from his, hers carried the invisible weight of something he would never understand, something that didn't show on credentials or in billing records or in the shadow boxes that hung on living room walls. She didn't speak. She waited. That was another technique from before, let the other person fill the silence. Chen opened her folder. According to our protocol, nurses do not perform needle decompression. That is a physician's procedure. You deviated substantially from your scope of practice. Recklessly, in fact, given the patient's critical status. The words hung in the fluorescent air. Not true. Fundamentally, completely untrue. Megan had performed needle decompressions in operating theaters under fire. She taught needle decompression to combat medics using actual patients and live ammunition nearby. She'd saved lives with this technique in countries that no longer existed on modern maps. But that nurse had no credentials. That nurse had no license. That nurse was dead. We have documentation of your actions. Sterling slid the paper across the counter, fabricated, of course, because Megan had written her own notes with exactness. But Hargrove's investigators had written their own version. Reckless endangerment. Practicing medicine without a license. We have no choice. It isn't a choice, Hargrove said, and his smile was thin as a blade. It's a termination. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Megan took one measured breath. She looked at the investigator. She looked at Sterling, whose hands had trembled slightly when she'd said that thing about bodies in places he couldn't pronounce, whose wife had called him twice during his shift, whose insurance fraud had probably paid for that new Tesla in his reserved parking spot. Then she unpinned her badge and set it carefully on the counter, its small weight somehow carrying more significance than any words she could say. All right. Her voice was steady. Neither accepting nor protesting. Just a statement of fact, delivered in a tone that had once commanded platoons. The investigator's pen stopped moving. He looked up from his notes. Something in that single word, all right, had registered differently than he expected. This wasn't a nurse who'd been caught. This was something else entirely. Security arrived within 4 minutes. 2 of them, young, uncomfortable. Megan walked to her locker with them beside her, not behind her, as if she might run or fight or cause a scene. She pulled out her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the one nobody had ever seen, and her personal effects. A photo of her son. A coffee mug from the commissary at Norfolk. A small wooden box containing exactly 7 challenge coins, each one representing a life she'd saved on the other side of the world, each one telling a story that would never be declassified. The walk to the parking garage took 4 minutes. The security guards didn't speak. Megan didn't speak. Her badge access was already revoked. The security system had moved at Hargrove's command with supernatural speed, almost as if someone higher up had already decided this moment before it happened. She sat in her 2019 Subaru in the early light and didn't start the engine for 7 minutes. The rain hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming. Denver didn't get rain in April usually, but the forecast had shifted. Sometimes weather moved faster than people could predict. The drive home took 23 minutes. She didn't use the radio. She didn't use her phone. She drove in silence down Spee Boulevard toward the neighborhoods where nurses and teachers and normal people lived in houses with normal mortgages and normal futures. Her hands were steady on the wheel. That was another thing from before. Fear and rage were luxury emotions, and she'd learned not to afford them. Her house was a 1960s rancher with a detached garage, 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom she shared with her son. When she'd bought it 7 years ago on a nurse's salary, plus the black account she still maintained, plus the quarterly payments for her silence that came from a Pentagon office that officially didn't know she existed, the neighbors had assumed she had family money or a good divorce settlement. She'd let them believe that. The truth was more complicated. The truth was that she'd been paid in secret for 20 years for a job that had never happened, and that silence was currency if you knew how to spend it carefully. Megan sat at the kitchen table as the sun climbed over the eastern plains. The Subaru had made it home. Her hands had made it home. Her body had made it home, and that was the most important thing because the rest of her was still in room 314, still hearing the whisper of Chief, still knowing that the boy she'd pulled from a collapsed compound in 2004 had lived through 2 decades of recovery that nobody would ever know about, had become a soldier because of what he'd survived, had ended up in an army hospital with catastrophic injuries and no voice and a name that changed depending on which government file you looked at. The scrubs were still wet against her skin. She hadn't changed. She'd driven through Denver in her hospital uniform, a badge hole in her chest where authority had been pinned, and nobody had noticed because in a city of 715,000 people, nobody noticed a tired woman in scrubs driving slowly through the rain that had arrived without warning. The clock on the microwave said 0738 when she finally saw her son's car pull into the driveway. Marcus, her Marcus, not the veteran Marcus, not the boy from Sangin, was 14 and had a shift at the car wash that started at 0900. He'd come home to grab his lunch before work. Instead, he found his mother at the kitchen table in her hospital scrubs, still wearing the wet jacket, her eyes red-rimmed in a way he'd never seen before. His eyes were his father's eyes, sharp and intelligent, and they took in the scene in one measure, the scrubs, the time, the red eyes, the badge hole in her chest like a bullet hole that had missed by inches. Mom. His voice was careful. 14-year-old boys learn to be careful around mothers who cried. Why are you home? Megan opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. The words wouldn't come. Not there was an emergency. Not I had to leave. Not the Pentagon called and everything is ending. Not I'm sorry, baby, but I have to disappear again. The words she needed didn't exist in the English language. They didn't exist in any language. Some things couldn't be said because saying them would make them real, and if they were real, then the life she'd tried to build here, the normal kitchen table, the normal sun, the normal garage, the normal mathematics of staying in one place and loving one person and building something that didn't end in blood, all of that would collapse like a building struck from above. Mom. Marcus stepped closer. Are you hurt? She wasn't hurt. That was the thing. She wasn't hurt at all. She was something else entirely, and he was just beginning to understand that his mother was not what he'd always thought she was. The tears came not from pain but from the weight of silence, from 20 years of carrying the memory of a boy with dust in his hair and fear in his eyes, from 3 hours ago when that same boy, now a man, had looked at her with recognition that crossed 2 decades like it was nothing. She couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not when the Pentagon systems were still processing, not when somewhere in a classified facility someone was reading a name that was supposed to stay dead, not when the only thing standing between Marcus and the life she'd chosen was the ability to say nothing. The rain hammered the kitchen window like it was trying to break in, and Megan O'Brien, Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, the person who'd been officially dead for 20 years, sat at her kitchen table in her wet scrubs and could not find any words at all. Her son found the shadow box in the basement that morning, buried under winter coats in a plastic storage bin marked camping gear. It was mahogany, maybe 16 inches wide, with a glass front and Marine Corps emblem etched in brass. Inside, mounted on burgundy felt, were 5 medals he had never seen before. Bronze Star with a Combat V device. Purple Heart. Another medal he didn't recognize. And beneath them all, a folded citation with his mother's name stamped across the top in military serif font. He was 14. Old enough to read. Old enough to understand that the woman who made his lunches and helped with algebra homework had done something. He drove to Sacred Heart at 2 in the afternoon, the shadow box heavy in his backpack like it weighed more than wood and metal. Security stopped him at the front entrance, but he walked past them anyway, that specific kind of quiet walk that doesn't invite questions, and found the nurse at the station sorting charts. She was young, maybe 30, with the kind of tired that came from double shifts. "My mom was fired this morning," he said, placing the shadow box on the counter between them. "They need to see these." The nurse looked at the boy first, then at the box. Her hands moved toward it like she was afraid it might disappear. When she opened the lid, her hands began to tremble. She read the nameplate aloud, her voice cracking on every word, Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, Navy Special Warfare Command. The sound of that name, spoken out loud for the first time in 20 years in the fluorescent light of a hospital corridor, made something inside the walls of Sacred Heart shift. Nurses stopped moving. A resident froze mid-stride. One of the board members who'd signed off on Megan's termination 3 hours earlier went very still. That was when the doors to the stairwell opened and a man in dress blue stepped into the corridor. Full uniform. Shoulder boards. The kind of presence that made the air pressure change. SEAL Team 3 emblem on his chest. Behind him, 2 more in uniform. And behind them, a woman in a dark suit with FBI credentials clipped to her belt. The SEAL team leader, call sign Breaker, call sign because his voice sounded like gravel being processed through a coffee maker, stepped forward and placed his hand on the shadow box. His eye scanned the medals, then lifted to the trembling nurse, then to the boy who had walked past security with the weight of his mother's real life in his backpack. He began to speak, and the corridor went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in room 314 wheeze 3 corridors down. "Bronze Star with Valor," he said, touching the first decoration. The room held its breath. "Purple Heart." Another pause. The board members exchanged looks that suggested they were beginning to understand they had made a catastrophic mistake. "Joint Service Commendation Medal for the Sangin extraction." His voice dropped. "Operation that officially never happened. 20 years ago. This woman pulled a child out of a collapsed compound while rounds were still coming through the walls. Then she disappeared because someone classified what she did so deep that even this hospital's system wasn't supposed to flag her name." The FBI agent stepped forward. Her partner was already moving toward Hargrove's office 2 corridors down. Dr. Hargrove attempted to access sealed military records belonging to Senior Chief O'Brien at 4:37 this morning, the FBI agent said, her voice flat and federal. To forge disciplinary documentation. To bury her background. The moment he triggered the access protocol, 3 federal agencies lit up like a Christmas tree. NSA. Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. Naval Criminal Investigative Service. He was flagged before he finished reading the first page. Hargrove appeared in his doorway at that moment, and something in his face collapsed. Not anger. Not defiance. Recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when you realize you have just committed a felony against someone whose name exists in sealed vaults that the FBI answers to. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, the NCIS agent said, her credentials flashing silver in the overhead lights, "You're under federal arrest for attempted forgery of military documents, insurance fraud totaling $847,000 across comatose VA patients, and intimidation of a military witness." The handcuffs clicked shut with the finality of a closing door. You have the right to remain silent. His walk through the lobby, the perp walk, hands behind his back, the cuffs biting into wrists that had signed insurance claims for phantom MRI charges, was witnessed by 12 nurses, 5 doctors, and 1 surgical resident who would be telling this story for the next decade. His face had the color of someone watching his life evaporate. The medical license. The 6-bedroom house in Cherry Creek. The country club membership. All of it, gone. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. When someone whispered "Doctor," he actually flinched. 6 months later, Sacred Heart's newsletter would note that Dr. Hargrove was no longer practicing medicine. The rumor mill was kinder. He was teaching CPR certification classes at a strip mall medical school next to a tax preparation office and a vape shop. Minimum wage. The name tag read Steve. He'd stopped correcting people who called him by his first name only. But Megan was already walking. She moved down the corridor with her son beside her, both of them moving toward room 314 like they'd been pulled by a rope neither of them could see. The SEAL team leader followed. The FBI agents held back. This was not federal business anymore. This was what happened when a warrior met the life she'd saved. Marcus Wade was sitting up in bed for the first time in weeks. Awake. His eyes tracking. His right hand trembling on the blanket like it was remembering how to be part of a body. When Megan stepped into the doorway, his gaze locked onto hers with the force of a physical thing. His left hand rose from the bed, shaking. She crossed the 3 meters between them in 2 strides. "Chief," he whispered. His voice was gravel and rust and something that had been buried so long it was learning to breathe again. He gripped her hand like it was the only solid thing in a room that was tilting. "You came back." "I never left," she said. Her voice was different now. Cleaner. No apology in it. No deference. Just the voice of someone who'd been validated by the weight of federal machinery and the presence of a man in dress blues who had flown 800 miles to tell the world what she'd done. "I was always here." Her son stood in the doorway, still holding the shadow box. The SEAL team leader placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Not speaking. Just witnessing. The way a warrior bears witness to another warrior coming home. It would take 3 weeks for the hospital administration to offer Megan the position of Director of Trauma Services. New office. Corner window. Title. Salary. Everything a decorated veteran deserved. She declined the office. Kept the title. Requested to stay in scrubs, assigned to the trauma bay and ICU, where the work happened that actually mattered. The administrator nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer. Because that's what happens when you carry a secret at the weight of a Bronze Star. You don't stop moving. You don't ask for a desk. You ask for access to the wounded, and you work until they breathe on their own. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 20 years of it. The Pentagon's classified files stayed sealed. The operation in Sangin remained officially buried. But somewhere in a vault in Norfolk, someone updated a database that had been frozen since 2004. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien was no longer MIA. No longer erased. No longer just a night nurse named Megan at Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver. She was walking through that corridor in scrubs and sneakers, and every veteran who saw her badge understood exactly who she was. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. So here's what I want to know: if you found out someone you worked alongside every day was carrying that kind of secret, how would it change the way you saw them? Would you look at the quiet people in your life differently? Let me know in the comments. And please, like and subscribe. There are more stories like this one, stories about the people around you who are stronger than you know.